In today's video, I'll take a trip down memory lane as we explore my painting journey from when it started in 2020 up until today.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Phalanx Miniatures.
The biggest hurdle you have to overcome when you start this hobby is that the learning curve is quite steep, to say the least, and your first mini is not going to look like the way you imagined.
You think that your finished figure will look like that beautiful box art or that incredible paint job you saw on Instagram. You work up your courage to start painting the mini, you do your very best, spending hours painting a single figure, and then it ends up looking like this.
But with this video, I would like to show you that that's perfectly fine and you just cannot teleport yourself from being a beginner to an expert. And even if you could, you probably shouldn't, because you would miss out on most of the fun. You know that cliche about the journey and the destination? Well, it's kinda true.
So if you want to see my terrible first attempts and then follow along as I discover volumetric highlights, learning airbrushing, finding new paint brands and tools, trying out contrast paints and oil washes, all the way to non-metallic metal, color theory, combining brush textures with airbrush and stipple glazing, then let's turn back the time to 2020, see where it all started, and let's see if you all can learn something from my journey and apply it to yours.
At the beginning of the pandemic, I was still working from home in Paris, and I felt that I needed a new hobby, something that has nothing to do with a monitor and I can do it with my own hands.
Before everything closed down, I walked by a Warhammer store every day on my commute to work, looking at painted models in the store display. I had been into Warhammer computer games and read a ton of books by then as well, so collecting minis and painting them seemed like a pretty good way to spend my time, and I had no idea what I was getting into. So I did some research on YouTube, meaning that I spent dozens of hours watching tutorials and guides, including a lot of the original Games Workshop painting videos. And then I ordered a bunch of models and all the tools I thought I needed. Of course, later I would learn that half of those tools were not the right ones for me, but we will talk about that a bit later.
And finally, I got to paint my first minis, and I was confident and terrified at the same time. I had never done anything like this before, but I did my research, or so I thought, so now I just had to apply it.
Well, you know the basic official painting method of base coat, wash, highlight and done? It sounds easy and even simplistic to me now, but back then it was a completely new concept, and with zero practical experience, let's just say that I got like 70% of the theory right. But the actual physical painting I did was a mess. First of all, I simply couldn't do a simple base coat. I was trying to do the 2 thin coats thing I heard mentioned in the Games Workshop videos and other tutorials, but it seemed like even 10 coats wouldn't properly cover a surface, at which point I overcompensated with the thickness, which of course created texture and looked terrible. One of the things I didn't know at the time is that I simply purchased bad paints for a beginner. I found a huge box of Army Painter model paints on Amazon. They were cheap and some guides were actually recommending them, so I just went for it. Turns out that Army Painter paints had a weird gel-like consistency that is quite different from the other brands, and the pigment in them also had a terrible tendency to separate and just settle at the bottom of the bottle. So sometimes I was essentially trying to paint with just a medium with very little pigment, which, as you can imagine, led to not exactly great results.
As far as I know, Army Painter has since then redesigned their paints and they are supposed to be better now, but back then for a new painter they were quite terrible.
But fortunately for me, I also bought some Citadel paints very early on to match the color schemes I saw in the Games Workshop videos, and I realized that despite the terrible pots they came in, the paints are much easier to work with, and some of those paints I still love and use to this day. Of course, this didn't solve all my issues with thinning paints properly, but it helped quite a bit.
The other major issue I had at the time was just simply being neat. I couldn't paint an edge for the life of me without smudging everything around it, and that was especially fun with metallic paints.
Just look at the gold trim on my poor Dreadnought. You know how many times I had to repaint the panel and the trim to make it look at least this good? You don't want to know. The problem was that I simply didn't know and use some of the basics, like for example how to brace your arm and hands to make your brush perfectly steady. I was trying to just hold my whole arm in the air and by sheer force of will try to make it not tremble. Believe me, that is an impossible task. Not to mention that I was using low quality brushes. I didn't know how to clean them correctly, which meant that they didn't hold their tips, and I was always trying to paint with the smallest possible brush since I thought that would help me being neat, which is exactly the opposite of what you should do. But I persevered. Maybe my models were not as good as I had imagined, but every new one seemed a little better than the previous one, and that kept me hooked. My models became neater over time. I started using edge highlights and even some volumetric highlights here and there, with very mixed results.
The first big change in my painting style happened when I realized that I can use the airbrush for more than just priming and base coating. Previously I had been trying to perfect the Games Workshop painting style, which you can see in their official videos, without realizing that they are not actually using that on the box arts.
Once I realized that I would never achieve the box art style by simply doing the traditional base coat, wash, edge highlight method, I started looking more into volumetric highlights, which is essentially highlighting the model in a more realistic way based on how the light is hitting it. I was pretty bad at that though, since for that to work, on top of understanding the theory behind it, you need to do some blending and transitions that I felt was beyond my abilities back then. But I had a basic airbrush kit already from the very beginning. Since we were basically locked into the apartment due to the pandemic, I needed to find a way to prime my minis without a spray can. So while I was busy learning basic brushwork and paint thinning with the brush, I was also blundering my way through learning the airbrush, at least to the level where I could use it for priming and base coating. And by this time I managed to get to the stage where I didn't want to throw my airbrush out of the window half the time I was using it. So now I started experimenting with zenithal highlights, colorful underpaintings and transitions on at least bigger armor panels, creating colorful shadows by spraying an ink from below and stuff like that.
This seemed like the holy grail of miniature painting for me because it was faster, smoother and more impressive looking than anything that I could achieve with the brush at the time. Combined with some basic techniques that I already knew more or less, like edge highlighting, I was creating some miniatures that I was really happy with.
Coincidentally, this was around the same time, March 2021 or so, when I started uploading pictures of some of my models to Instagram as well. If you want to see some of these early models and of course all the newest ones as well, you can find the link in the description. Maybe consider following as well if you are already there.
In this period I painted quite a few models that I still enjoy looking at today, but painting like this with the airbrush also has its limitations.
It works mostly on spraying the model as a whole or larger surfaces like the armor panels of a Redemptor Dreadnought for example, but it's difficult to use for smaller details. The airbrush also produces a very distinct clean look with a little bit of dusty texture if you look closely. It can look a bit artificial, which might suit some models more than others. It also tends to wash out colors and make them more desaturated, less vibrant than if you apply them with a brush. This lens point also led me to a new discovery though, Vallejo paints. Since I wasn't trying to imitate the Citadel painting style anymore, I also bought a couple of other colors, especially the ones I saw YouTubers use in their airbrushes. And Vallejo proved to be a great alternative to Citadel paints. It was more convenient in dropper bottles, especially for airbrushing, and it had a huge range with some great and vibrant colors. It wasn't significantly higher quality than Citadel, but I loved that I had more choices.
The next big phase in my miniature painting journey is an interesting one because looking back it seems like I was moving in two very opposing directions. I discovered non-metallic metal on the one hand and contrast paints and oil washes combined on the other.
Let's start with non-metallic metal first. This technique seemed to be the most difficult thing you can achieve in miniature painting at the time. It really intrigued me, but I was also literally afraid to try it. It was simply too daunting. But after having watched one too many videos about it, I simply grabbed a random model off the shelf, a Chaos Terminator for some reason, and started painting it. This was the model, and as you can see I never actually finished it. It was a decent first attempt I think, even though there are so many things I could do better now. But I got so excited about it that I simply abandoned it and started a new model which turned out to be much worse.
But that's how it usually goes. The second attempt usually is worse than the first one, and then you try again, and the third one is slightly better, you stick with it, and then you keep improving.
So that is what I did, and some of the models I painted around this time are actually half decent, like for example this Black Legion Obliterator, or some of the Ultramarine special characters. And this actually led to the first video on the YouTube channel as well, a fully non-metallic metal Death Guard Terminator, which might not be the greatest according to my current standards, but at the time it represented a big step up in quality for me.
But while I was learning the arcane techniques of non-metallic metals, I was also starting projects in a completely different direction.
If you're anything like me, you probably have some special characters and hero minis, but you probably also have a bunch of troops that you want to paint either for actually playing with them, or because you simply got them in some boxes as extras and you want to see them painted.
Painting in a non-metallic metal style is not exactly fast, and you cannot paint everything to the highest possible standard. So I was searching for ways to paint my models relatively fast, but also relatively to a high standard.
In some of my first attempts, like my Orc Kill team, I combined some of my earlier techniques like zenithal highlights and edge highlights with contrast paints, and I quite liked the results. Then I added oil paints into the mix, since this allowed me to push the contrast on these minis without using traditional washes. Applying a traditional wash means that you have to repaint quite a bit of the model again after the wash dries, but with oils you can simply wipe them away from places you don't want them to stain, saving a lot of time, so it looked like a great new tool to add to my arsenal. This actually led to one of the most successful videos on the channel, the Cursed City speed painting one, where I was using contrast and oils to paint all the good guys in the box in almost no time at all. The video is quite embarrassing to look at now, but a lot of people seemed to like it at the time. Since then I have been using this contrast technique and different variations of it to paint larger groups of models at once. One of my favorite one is the Underworld Skaven Warband that I did last year. And I would really encourage all of you to try both high quality and speed painting techniques, because no matter which one you prefer, knowing one will benefit the other.
And that brings us close to the beginnings of my current style and interests. In this period I started perfecting and combining things that I already knew, but I also discovered a couple of things that changed the way I paint quite dramatically.
I bought my first fancy airbrush since I wanted to start using it more for detail work and try out a new technique where I combine brushwork with airbrush glazing. And the first attempt turned out quite cool, I think, on an infinity tag model. The idea here was to sketch in the highlights by brush and then glaze over them with the airbrush, smoothing them out much faster than what I could do with standard brush glazes. Since then, this has become one of my favorite techniques that I am trying to perfect on all my latest models, and instead of just using it to smooth things out better and easier, I'm also trying to use it to create textured surfaces as well by first painting in the details and then partially obscuring and integrating them with the airbrush. I'm also getting more and more intrigued by some of the effects you can achieve with the airbrush on top of things you painted with the brush, like for example this glowing skin of the Infinity Avatar I have recently painted. And of course I can't forget my favorite obsession, non-metallic metal, which is the biggest challenge and the most fun for me at the same time. I'm constantly trying to improve it, trying out new approaches, improving my light placement, smoothness, adding secondary highlights, upping the contrast and the vibrancy of colors.
Speaking of colors, those are another obsession of mine lately, and I first started by discovering that I like working with matte colors much better than satin ones.
I bought my first Scale 75 and AK Interactive paints, and since then AK has become my workhorse paint range that I use for the majority of my color choices. But I also realized that one of the things I would like to improve on is the vibrancy of colors on my minis, so I bought and started experimenting with some very vibrant color ranges like the Artist range from Scale 75 and more recently Chimera colors. Both of these turned out instant favorites for me since they are super pigmented, absolutely matte and very easy to work with. But I'm not just relying on buying the most pigmented colors, I'm also experimenting with some of my old techniques of colorful underpainting and some color theory to add some more vibrancy into my paint jobs. I still have some ways to go, but I think my latest models are way more vibrant and saturated compared to some of my older ones. So this is where I am now. I went from this model to this one in 4 years' time. I'm pretty happy with the progress, but there is so much more to learn and I will keep using the channel to upload my progress.
I hope that this video provided some new ideas for some of you, maybe some new directions to explore, new things to try. And if not, at least it provided me with a good opportunity to take out my old models and look at them and to put these couple of years of painting into some kind of perspective. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Smash that like button and the subscribe button, and then see you in the next one.